Check out this highly enlarged image of a star field. Notice how the background is modeled. Okay, all over this background. Laser pointer. How this background is all modeled. It is made of millions of dots, pixels. If things were perfect, all of these background dots would be the same shade of dark gray. There would be none of these single white dots that you see all over the place, these little white dots. They're called hot pixels. This line, which you probably could see, this one right through here, all right, would not exist. The signal from the background pixels would be of uniform darkness and clean. The astro imager would not have to worry about noise. But alas, things are not perfect. Slight variations in the way the electrons record photons and slight variations in the way the photons arrive make for slight differences in the shades of gray. You can get rid of most of these variations by averaging them out over time. But using mathematics on many individual shots, you can clean things up. Now, as we flip through this stack of images, notice how the white dots stay in the same position, while the larger white areas, the stars, move around. That is because the stack is dithered. Note how much of this discussion will be illustrated with hot pixels, since they show up the best. But dithering does not really focus on just hot or cold pixels. Hot pixels report higher values than they really should. Cold report lower. As a matter of fact, by the time you get to stacking an image, the hot cold pixels may already have been cleaned out by bias and dark applications, and a little by the flats or by a cosmetic correction. That does not mean that there is not a residual flaw where the hot pixel had been removed. What happens in bias and darks and cosmetic correction is an attempt to correct the bad information of a hot or cold pixel based on neighboring pixels or some other statistical trick. The math is pretty good, but not perfect. So some slightly off information can remain in that pixel. That information will be further smoothed by the math of integration and integrating and averaging out the differences between the subframes, but it could very well still be there. For illustration purposes, though, notice how in this clip, the hot pixels are staying in the same place while the stars are flopping around. The hot pixels are staying in the same place, or were staying in the same place, because that is where they are on the sensor. Meanwhile, since the imaging sensor was dithered, the stars were shifting around on the sensor between each image. You will also notice on the one slide that I bumped into the telescope. And when I bumped into the telescope, I slightly moved it during the exposure. So it is a bit of misshapen stars. Dithering can help with these, but really, this image would probably have been rejected before we even took it into processing. Although this looks pretty much the same as a couple of slides earlier, it is different. I registered the stars so that they are all aligned. Notice how now the stars are staying put while the little white blobs are moving around. Because I moved the pointing of the telescope between shots, that is, I dithered, the distance between the hot pixel out here, and the center of the star has changed. In order to get the star in one shot and another to line up with the star in another sub, I have to move the star. As I move the star, all of the pixels, including the hot, cold, and otherwise extreme, go along with it. Since there is a distance difference between the star and those pixels after dithering, the new hot pixel position of the registered sub no longer matches the hot pixel position of the first. In each successive stub, I've changed that distance between the hot pixel and the center of the star. So when I lined up all the stars, the bad pixels were spread around. It should be noted again that this is not just the hot pixels we are worried about. They are just illustrative of the things that are moving around. I also changed the distance of the star to any other pixel on the sensor. In other words, the bright star pixels will always be bright, But the dim background that happens to be a little darker here than it should be, a little brighter there, will now be mixed in randomly with one that is perhaps a little brighter than it should have been. Whatever it is, the randomness smooths out the background. Let's look at how that works. This is what it looks like to register the stars. Place one frame on top of another and move it around until the stars align. So there's one frame, there's the other. The stars are aligned or not, stars align. And you can see when the stars align, the hot pixels and all the other pixels no longer align. They have moved. Let's look at the values we get from the 9 subframes. We're going to record the pixel value in 8 columns along a given row. Notice that the data from one exposure to the next, as we go down the column of different exposures, remain pretty much the same, but they are not identical necessarily. That is because imperfections happen. Here is a 9 where everything else is a 5. Here's a 0 when everything else there is a 5. Now, these exceptions are weirdos. And we do not like weirdos in this hobby. No, that was a joke. Weirdos are welcome in this hobby. What we do not allow are numbers outside the 2 standard deviations from the mean, or outside a percentage of the average, or the highest and lowest number, depending on what our rejection algorithm says. But weirdos is simpler to say. Let's get rid of the weirdos and average things out again. What you get for averages looks a lot smoother than the first time around. By removing the numbers in red above and then recomputing the averages, we get different numbers. You have a general background of about 5 and then a rise in the middle that may be a small star, and then it goes back down to 5. Let's take a look at what happens if we don't dither, though. That was dithered shots. 9 exposures without dithering, not too much difference up on top here, okay, except it's one column over here. That column had a bad pixel in it, and so every time it reported a 0. Since the telescope always pointed to the same spot, that particular pixel always reported a 0, a dead pixel. Hot pixels would regularly report a 10 or whatever the highest possible number is, although hot pixels are anything that repeatedly report more than they should. And as you can see, it doesn't average out nearly as nicely along here as being a smooth star. So looking at the results, we see that with no dither, we find a black pixel in column F for all of our pictures. And we get a value of 4.2 or even 4.8 after the rejection of the weirdos. Let's look at how much more sensible the numbers are for the, I think I said that right, how much sensible they are for the dithered overall. Even without rejection, the dithered set gives us some kind of useful data. Use rejection and look how much smoother this whole transition is. Okay, so that is why we dither. Before we go on, let's talk as an aside for a moment about some ideas that would raise their head in this kind of discussion now and again. One is about auto dithering. I've actually heard it called that. Okay, the point of dithering is to move the telescope around so that the bad pixels and other noise is randomly distributed, and thus less noticeable compared to registered details like stars. Yeah, that's the point. Well, the lazy little newbie says, my mount has quirks, and it kind of moves around a little bit all by itself anyway. So everything is kind of randomly distributed, and that's my dithering. Well, newbie, I've got 2 levels of response to that. As the noise moves around, so does every other detail in the picture, giving you sloppy stars and other messes. And if your mount is that poopy, it's probably not randomly poopy. There's a directional drift, perhaps a periodic error. If your mount is moving over time because of bad tracking from the motor or polar alignment, then it is dragging a collection of photons into lines and not what they should be. Thus, you're going to have what's called walking noise, A little hard to see in this picture here, but over here I manipulated the picture to show you this. See the streaks? That's walking noise. In this case, the astroimager was smart enough to get very short exposures. And then when the galaxy and stars were registered, they looked pretty good without trailing. But the same registration pulled all the other trails of photons into long lines called walking noise. Ain't no such thing as auto dithering. Another miscellaneous thought is about direct dithering. Some mounts are so well built and maintained, perhaps with special location encoders, and so well aligned that they can pretty well take 5 minutes and perhaps longer exposures without any guiding. And some people, portable rigs are so small that they don't even have room for a guider. But you still want the noise suppression of dithering. Nina, SGP, and other session manager programs offer dithering without guiding. You need no camera, off-axis guider, or guide scope. You already have the connection between the mount and the computer and between the exposures of the main camera. The session program manager will send commands to dither. This is often called direct dithering. You're not guiding, you're just dithering between shots. How you do it varies from program to program, and it is sometimes not easy to find. But basically, between shots, the session manager program sends a signal to the mount to move so many pixels in one direction or another. And when the mount reports it's done so, or after an appropriate time, the session starts the main imaging camera again. This differs from the more common dithering where when told to dither, the guide program changes the sensor coordinates of the guide star's lock point to a different location, and then continues to guide until the star is at the lock point. And then it sends a message and then the session manager knows that it's where it belongs. The next exposure on the main camera is in a slightly different target of the sky. Another preliminary thought is that if you asked how much you want to dither, if you are asked, figure out what the units are. Your arc seconds per pixels change depending on your correct configuration, including the telescope focal length and the pixel size. A 150 millimeter long guide scope working with the guide camera with pixels that see 2 arc seconds each will move 20 arc seconds if you tell it to move 10 pixels. If you put that same camera in an off-axis guider, it will move substantially fewer arc seconds because there are fewer arc seconds of sky in each target pixel. And that 20-second move of 10 guide pixels will still be 20 arc seconds of movement in the imaging camera because you're actually moving the mount. But there may be some completely different number of imaging camera pixels in that move. So keep all that straight. If your buddy says he moves 4 pixels in each dither, that means nothing unless you know how much that translates into motion across the sky in your guiding setup and your imaging rig, in your imaging camera. And please note that the kind of noise that dithering minimizes can generally be thought of as small pattern noise. That is the same pixel or row or column of pixels reporting incorrect data. That's not what's happening here. If the bad data takes up a lot of area in the chip, like this light leak or amp glow perhaps, dithering will not help you much. You just can't move far enough away between exposures and get it properly dithered. So much for the miscellany. How do most of us dither? Well, you probably already have the equipment. You generally need a guider. There's a guide camera with using a separate guide scope or an on-axis guider or even or an off-axis guider. With direct dithering, you can skip this and rely on the accuracy of the mount. The equipment needs to be connected to a computer, so you need cables to the computer and, of course, a connection from the computer to the mount, and, of course, the computer. And that computer, you need a session manager. This starts the imaging camera capturing and in between captures the commands of the guide program. Maxim and some other session managers will have their own guide program internally. Many session manager programs, however, call an auxiliary program to do the actual dithering. For most of us, the session manager is Nina or SGP, although there are many others, and both ask PhD to do the guiding. As an ASI Air, also incorporates PhD2 to do the dithering, or at least a subset of PhD2. But even if you use Maxim or another program to guide, concepts are pretty much the same. The computer you are using is connected to the mount in various ways depending on the mount, but at any rate, the same cables and controls that allow you to the mount to slew or center on a target can accept commands to do the dithering positions and things like that. So you already have all that. You can see that the basic questions related to setting up dithering are the same in various session manager programs. Here are two popular programs, Nina on top, SGP on the bottom. I've been using the bottom for years, and I've occasionally played with Nina, but not enough to get to know it. I know there are many Nina users out there who can correct or add to what I'm about to say on this program. So chip in over on the comments if you need to say something. Both need to be told how much you want to move each time you dither. In Nina, you tell the number and dither pixels. Below in SGP, you tell it the range you want to dither from small to extreme. You got 5 choices. You want to choose the value on either of these so that your imaging camera, not the guide camera, will shift about 10 seconds or 10 pixels overall. And remember, your imaging camera and guide camera arc seconds per pixel will probably be different. Whatever you choose, PhD2 then generates a random number between 0 and that number in Nina or whatever level you choose at SGP, and then sends the mount that far away. But let's talk for a moment about how much you want to move during a dither. The answer is about 10 pixels of the imaging camera. As you can see, to line up one image with the other in this photo on the left, I have to move the second subframe up and to the right a little bit. You can see how the overlap of the star is fine, but the edges of the frame are not overlapped. See them here? See how this sticks out a little bit and this sticks out? Come on, stick out like you're supposed to. There we go. And the opposite edge, the top, is not covered by that edge of the frame. So instead of 9 frames covering that edge of the bottom, so instead of 9 frames going into the final pick, I only have 8 in the non-overlapped areas. And if extremed enough, the overlap can get pretty big. The more you dither, the more ugly edge you get. We hate other ugly edges. The bigger the ugly edge would be if you dither more. And if we hate ugly edges, how do you think we feel about these big, big ugly edges? See how you get not the same representation across? On the other hand, if we do not move enough, there is a chance that you are pulling the bad pixels from one shot very close or even on to those of another. Even with the magic of stacking and pixel correction, you might yet see an anomaly. I would imagine that you can tell Nina how often to dither. I do not use Nina regularly, and that's one of those things you can correct me on. Those of you who take 5-minute long exposures will probably want to dither every frame. Those who take lots and lots of 15-second exposures cannot afford the overhead time of dithering each frame. So you may want to dither every 5th or 10th frame. If your mount is well behaved, corrects quickly compared to the timer it takes to get the sub-exposure on the main imager, go ahead and dither every frame. On the other hand, if your mount is poopy and it takes a while to settle, and particularly if you are using very short exposures on the main camera, then try dithering only once every 5 frames or so. Both Nina and SGP has a control to determine how long the guider must settle in the new position before starting the next exposure. You don't want this to be too tight, or you may never get the guider to settle just because of normal variations in seeing. It should never be tighter or close to the seeing value. But if too large when you have a few cycles of the guider taking more time than you need between the shots, so play this by ear. I don't see it in Nina, but SGP allows you to check a box and wait for several seconds before starting the main camera exposure. This helps if you have a sloppy mount with backlash. It means once you start the next camera image, there will be very little, if any, shifting to get to the dither lock point. And before we move on, note that both these programs have additional setup requirements for the guider. But we've talked about the main settings for the guiding. Nina has additional dither settings, but these are handled differently in PhD itself. And while you're setting things up, be sure to look into the brain under PhD2. Under the global settings, you will find a place to tell PH2 whether you want to move your scope randomly or in a spiral direction. Random is best because it is, random. With an averaged random is the best way to get rid of noise. But it takes decent mounts to respond. Spiral is said to be better if your mount suffers a little from sloppiness, and it would take longer to settle down after each movement. It's faster because it does not reverse direction and declination as much. You can also tell PhD2 and Nina whether to move only in RA. This helps if your mount has some real issues with backlash. However, be well that it could lead to a fixed pattern noise like that walking noise. And of course, some mounts, like Skyguiders, can only control in RA. Finally, you will notice a scale setting in PhD. These are for those who have SGP or other session managers which use small to extremely large qualitative type of descriptions for the amount of dither operation that will move the scope. This number should normally be left at 1.0, but can be set at different numbers to multiply the distances specified by the session manager. Remember, you are after a dither movement of about 10 imaging camera pixels. There's some experimentation in all of this to get something that moves at just the right amount to get a bad pixel in one shot away from the bad pixels in another shot without causing unnecessarily delays in starting that next shot. Dithering is not hard to do, and it works well to fight noise. Some people advocate instead of using cosmetic correction, cloning, or other techniques to control, they advocate those to control aberrant pixels. Some people with very clean CMOS cameras just seem to think that there are not enough bad pixels to worry about, and CMOS does not have column defects. Or some, those who believe in auto dithering, say that the natural deviation and random movement of the scope during a night of imaging means the bad pixels don't line up during stacking anyway. Okay, be that as it may, as I hope you have enough of the basics from this presentation to implement dithering into your works. You know the way and a bit of the how. Remember, though, that you have to try out some of this in your own backyard, even on a moony night, to work out the details that you'll be happy with. So if you're not doing it yet, quit dithering and start dithering. Thank you, folks. That's it.